Good evening. What's up, guys? How's it going? Thanks very much for coming back and joining once more. Another epic weekend, even if it wasn't the most epic of Grand Prix. I mean, it wasn't the most exciting, was it, as the Grand Prix got underway? But as a Grand Prix weekend, I don't know, tell me if you disagree, I thought it was pretty spectacular with all the stuff going on track and off track, the controversies, the dramas, the stewards' decisions, the protests and counter-protests, the drama and the soap opera running alongside this brilliant battle we have got typically on track. I think it's just making this a spectacular season. I mean, I hope you agree. I can't see why many people would disagree that this season is just brilliant. So it rolls on. And of course, you can see where this is going to go, can't you? You're going to go to Saudi Arabia. Lewis is probably going to win with Max coming second. They'll be neck and neck, quite literally, going into the final round of the season. I mean, you could have almost written it that way, and there it is. It's playing out. So I think we're, as I said many, many times on this show, we are witnessing something special this year, and I hope we're all appreciating just how good it is. Hello to you all from wherever you are around the world. I appreciate you all joining. Thank you very much. We're going to talk about all the things over the course of the weekend because there was, again, like there have been in recent weekends, so much. So where should we start? Shall we start with the fact that it was a brand new circuit to Formula One? Those who follow bike racing, I'm sure, will have been familiar with it. I thought it was a really cool circuit in terms of you could clearly see the drivers loved it. It was one of those drivers' circuits, really fast flowing. We talked about it last week that it was going to be a Silverstone-esque or a Suzuka-esque type circuit, maybe Mugello, with fast sweeping corners that kind of flow one into the other, and it was definitely that, which means the drivers love it. What it didn't do was give the most spectacular racing, although having said that, it wasn't as bad as I maybe thought it might have been looking at the circuit map on a bit of paper. So let's get your first thoughts on what did you think of the Qatar circuit? What do you think of that as a venue for F1? Should we go back there? Because there's still debate about whether the 10-year contract that's coming for Qatar to host Formula One's Grand Prix from 23 onwards, there's still debate about whether it'll be at that circuit or whether it'll be on a street track downtown or even somewhere else. So would you love to see us go back to that racetrack? I'd love to know your thoughts on that. Let's get those firing in while we talk about the details of that circuit. The bit on track, I think, was great in that, as I said, it suited Formula One cars really well. It really pushed them to the limits. It allowed them to lean on the tyres, and we'll talk about those in a bit, of course. On the aerodynamics, you know, it's a very fast circuit, but it was actually a relatively high downforce track because they needed that downforce to really hang on at the speeds they were going through. So I loved all of that. The curbs were proving to be a little bit of an issue, as you'll have seen, and as we also saw, it took its toll on tyres. I was surprised, don't know about you, and maybe bike fans can tell me, are those curbs, not the first set, but the second set, the sort of jagged diamond cut set that were causing the problems for the F1 cars, are they not brutal for motorbikes? I don't follow the bike racing closely enough, but if you run out onto those, is that not going to, I mean, literally destroy you and your bike? It felt that way. I mean, clearly it works. So what do we think? Anyway, Supertech Racing says it's a real driver's track. It should be kept on the calendar. Anthony Flynn, the track was okay, but unless Qatar improves their human rights record, F1 should not race there. Well, you could say that about half the races we go to. So it's a very difficult one, that. I mean, I get where you're coming from, and it's definitely a subject that needs talking about, but you could literally write off half the calendar if you don't agree with some of the human rights decisions that are made in countries, including our own, including America, including many, many others that we go to. So it is a real subject, and it is a difficult subject to broach, but let's keep it talking about the physical aspects of the track for now, and I think we'll have to come back to that one another day. Nice and fast, could follow close enough and pass, as scenario 7. That's a good point. It was a circuit where you could actually follow relatively closely. It wasn't... the laps weren't destroyed by cars following too closely to each other, which perhaps has been typical in many years. So perhaps that was due to the downforce setup, the aero setup of each car. It was very high downforce, and therefore perhaps you create a slightly bigger wake behind you, if you like, or a bigger pocket of air behind you. So the turbulence moves moves further away on a high downforce, high speed track than it would be on a high downforce, low speed track like Monaco, for example. So maybe that has an impact in that. That's a good point. Although on the flip side of that, Dmitry Zendrikov says, clearly hard to follow, but the new regs should change that. So yes, look, that's another point. If we do go back there, of course, it would be with the new cars, where the theory is that we won't have quite the same issues with following each other. So perhaps in the next generation of Formula One, circuits like that might fall more towards the modern Formula One cars' natural traits. If bikes touch the green, they get a penalty, so they keep on the track, says Paul Harrison. Okay, fair point. So maybe that's where we should use that as a nice segue onto the track limit discussion, because that's interesting. If bikes are really that clear cut, and if it's the same at every racetrack, so if you go off the racetrack and onto the green, the AstroTurf, you are out of track limits and get a penalty. If that's the way it works, and as I say, I'm not up to speed with bike racing well enough to know for sure, but if that's how it works, can't we do that in Formula One? Can't we just define the racetrack as the white line at every racetrack we go, and that's it? I've said before, it even says it in the rules. It even delineates the edge of the track in the regulations as the white line, and yet at all the racetracks we go to, we come up with different solutions for where track limits are. And I apologise for repeating myself, because I know I've banged on about this before, but the argument for doing so is that at some circuits it's more difficult to police track limits at certain corners than others, and so they move it to what is the most convenient place for the stewards or the marshals or the race control to monitor accurately those track limits. But this is the most technologically advanced sport in the world. If cricket can do it with slow motion cameras, if football can use goal line technology, if tennis can use things like Hawkeye, why on earth can't Formula One just set up some relatively simple technology at the corners that we think are going to be the most problematic, if not even every corner, and monitor it in the most accurate terms possible, and tell everybody this is how it's going to be at every racetrack, at every single race, for every year. You stay at least 2 wheels inside the white lines that delineate the edge of the track. I mean, it seems so simple, and I'm still baffled as to why we can't manage to achieve that in Formula One. I know it's not something you could probably just drop in halfway through a season, but this discussion's been ongoing for years, hasn't it? So surely that's something we can manage to achieve with the technology and the resources and the very clever people we have in this sport. Right, I hear that the white line will define track limits on all circuits next season. It's called the white line for a reason. Don't MotoGP bikes don't really go onto curbs like F1 cars who use all the curbs. So I suppose there is that argument that bikes, it's probably not the quickest way around the racetrack to use the curbs for a bike as it is for a Formula One car. So maybe that's an easier way for bikes to police that. It naturally polices itself because they will follow the fastest line, which probably for a bike is staying, at least in the most part, on the tarmac. So there we go. So, right, let's talk track limits then. Okay, let's talk track limits because, first of all, track limits changed all the way through the weekend, and that's okay. If they're going to police things the way they're policing them right now, it's fair enough to let them see how cars go on this circuit for the very first time, speak to the drivers, see who's abusing them, see why they're abusing them, see which corners can literally be gaining lap time by pushing wider than the track limits, and then you adjust it as the weekend goes on. So I didn't have a problem with that, given that that's how we currently do things in Formula One. The idea of the curbs breaking the car, I'm actually also not that against. I mean, I get that there's a safety implication if front wings start flying off, and we clearly don't want to see that. But the Formula One drivers knew very early on in the weekend that those curbs punish the cars in terms of breaking wings, breaking barge boards, damaging floors, even chassis in a couple of cases. And so once you know that information, a little bit like I'm just saying with the bikes there, as a driver and a team, you've got to be very strict yourself it should be self-policing about staying off the deepest curves, because they are car breakers, and that will ruin your Grand Prix, as we saw for a couple of people over the course of the weekend. So, you know, I don't think we need to have curbs that destroy cars, because it ends up interrupting races. It can be dangerous. But to have an element, whether it's AstroTurf, whether it's sausage curves, whatever it might be, a deterrent that means it's physically slower or going to negatively impact your Grand Prix if you go out there, will naturally, of course, mean the drivers don't want to go out there, because it won't save them time. It won't improve their weekend. It might have the potential to destroy it. So those kind of elements, if we're not going to use technology, can easily be implicated to or employed rather, to kind of self-police track limits. It's not the quickest and easiest thing to do, but there must be a solution that someone could come up with, which is very quick to install at certain parts of the racetrack when we decide it's those elements that need addressing. So you've got to throw your thoughts in on that one. Absolutely, I'd love to hear them. Someone else, was a good question that just came through there. Where was it? Oh yeah, talking about next year's tyres. Apologies, I can't see who it was, but the question was basically something along the lines of how will next year's larger wheels but low profile tyres be affected on curbs? Will it be different to this year? And the answer to that is absolutely it will, in terms of tyres and then particularly rim damage. You know, don't forget next year you've got a very low band of tyre around a much larger rim. This year you've got these great big balloon tyres which take up a huge amount of the compliance over lumps and bumps, and particularly over curbs. You see them, don't you, in the slow-mos oscillating. Well, next year we're not going to have that, and therefore that compliance gets moved from the tyre inboard to the suspension. That's what's going to take the ride of the car, you know, over the lumps and bumps, the contours of the circuit, that kind of thing. When it comes to curb strikes, what you're going to have is a much more immediate impact going through the rim, through the tyre and into the rim. And, you know, hitting large curbs like the ones we saw this weekend are much more likely to damage a rim on next year's cars than they would be this year, because the immediate impact is so close to the rim that the tyre will give up very quickly, and that impact will be felt directly on the rim in some cases. The suspension, of course, will try and cope with it, but I think there's going to be such an immediate impact in such close proximity to the actual edge of the rim that you could well see rim failures happening. So that's going to be one to keep an eye on. And obviously the teams will be well aware of that when we go to places like that next year. And it may be, like I've just said, that the teams have to very strictly instruct their drivers to stay away from some of those more brutal elements of a racetrack. Here's an interesting one. I've lost it again. The track limits, and again, apologies, I've lost it because it's flown by. Someone there just said track limits should be defined by the outside tyre, not the inside tyre. And therefore, what you're trying to suggest is that all four tyres should always remain inside of the white line on the racetrack. Now, that's an interesting point. That is a huge change. I mean, that is going to change the profile of racetracks massively if you go down that route. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but I'm not sure of the absolute reason why you would do it. As long as we have a clear rule and it's the outside of the line, as long as you keep two tyres inside the line, if that's how it's going to be, then that's how the rules have been written for years, in effect. I don't see why we need to change it. But if you did change it to all four wheels, well, obviously looking at much slower lap times, but you're also looking at very different lines through corners. You're looking at a completely different circuit configuration, in effect, the way the drivers can attack those corners. And I'm just not sure what we would gain by doing that. So that would be my response to that. I'm not sure why you'd want to go down that route. I actually don't mind where the track limit definition is, as long as it's the same every time. And then people at home watching can understand it very easily. You don't have to have been to check all the various websites or the latest Twitter feeds to find out what the latest definition of track limits are. That would be my issue with it all. Right, let's see where we are. What are we drinking tonight? I don't want to give the impression that I'm some kind of alcoholic. I'm not. But I'm drinking red wine tonight, so cheers. Four wheels inside the line sounds dull. It would be slower, and probably duller. I actually quite like the dynamics of cars using curbs, leaping over curbs, as long as they're not abusing them and going too far. That's my opinion on that. Right, shall we move on? And this is a good point to do it. William Harris says, why are drivers like Gasly and Bottas struggling with their race starts? So I would suggest that this weekend there was a huge disparity between the left and the right side of the grid. I'm not saying that's the only reason that these guys got poorer starts, but if you think about it, Bottas, who qualified in P3, who would have lined up right behind Lewis and been on the perfect side, racing line side of the grid, where it was very clean, as opposed to the opposite side where no cars were running, not even support races this weekend. Very, very dusty area, dusty circuit. And if you're not cleaning that up with cars constantly running over it, that dust and sand just builds and sits there. And therefore the circuit on that side offers a significant amount less grip than the racing line on the left-hand side. So Bottas got moved from that P3, which would have been a decent grid slot, tucked in behind Lewis, all the way back, didn't he, to the opposite side of the grid, I think in P6. Was he P6? He was P6, which put him on the pit wall side of the grid, which is the slippery side. Gasly also in P2 was on that side as well. So I think that definitely would have played a big role this weekend. I'm not sure, I haven't looked at the start in slow-mo again to see if that was a general trend of the left-hand side moving away faster. But that would be my assumption. Beyond that, there are a number of things that affect starts. I mean, there's a huge amount of it is driver procedure in terms of setting your throttle position, setting your clutch position. This thing can't be controlled now by the teams. Yes, they have various systems and settings in play, but it's very much now driver controlled more than it has been for years. So the driver has to play a huge role in how much throttle he applies, how much clutch he lets out, and then once he's got that bite point, how much he then feeds in, and at the same time applying more or less throttle. At what point you're changing gears through that phase of wheel spin at the beginning. So there are, and of course on top of that, the circuit grip level at the position where you start, which could be very different from the circuit grip level when you did your practice starts at the end of the pit lane. There are all these little factors that come into play, together with, of course, your reaction speed. Bottas is typically a very good starter. We've seen that many times, haven't we? But it's about managing the start given the situation or the conditions that your car's in. And if you don't get it perfectly right first time, it's all very well saying adapt to the grip levels that you've got underneath you, but by that point it's too late in comparison to others who did get a good start. So what you might see is Valtteri getting a poor launch initially, maybe doing a very, very good job of compensating for that, but it's too late. It's too late to look at his start and say it was a good one, because if you don't get it perfect when others are, you've massively lost out. So it's not necessarily that he's just doing a bad job or Gasly is just doing a bad job. It's just that if you don't get it right, if you don't get it, and I'm talking about perfect, then it looks very, very bad, even if you make a great recovery. And I suspect, given that they were on difficult sides of the racetrack, that may have played a big part this weekend. Right. There's a little Bottas joke. Bottas to quick fit fitter. Well done, Nick Falul. It's been a while since we've had a couple of those. He didn't have a good weekend, did he, Valtteri? I mean, it was going well, and if he'd lined up in P3, as I said, it could have been a really strong weekend for Mercedes. I mean, all right, they won the race, so it's not a disaster by any stretch. But Valtteri's side of the garage just didn't go well from the moment they got the penalty, and we'll talk about those in a second. Moving back down the grid, he was on that poor starting side. He got a poor start. He found himself way tucked down in the pack. And he just didn't have that killer instinct that, as I think we keep saying, that we would have expected somebody like Lewis. And actually we did see Max, finding their way through the gaps in almost no time. And in the same way that Lewis did it in Brazil, driving his way after a penalty, finding his way through the field, doing whatever it takes to get by. Within a few laps, this weekend we saw the same, but the other way around. And it wasn't as many places for Max, but by lap 5 we had those two out in front again and then just disappearing from the field. There's a gulf between those two drivers and the rest when it comes to current performance with their cars, amongst the current grid, I think. And it really highlighted it this weekend, didn't it? So, all right, there we go. So let's talk about, should we talk about penalties? Right, there we go. B Cafe says, Lewis and Max are so good. Perez and Bottas pale to do their job properly. So, Sergio Perez and Valtteri Bottas didn't have the best weekends, of course, this weekend. Sergio actually, I thought, made a really strong recovery, and it was only because they switched him onto that two-stop strategy in response to the tyre failures, just to make sure to play it safe and make sure they didn't have a problem, that he was kind of compromised from finishing on the podium, because I think he would have possibly or probably made P3 if he'd copied the same one-stop strategy that Alonso had made. I mean, even arguably, if they hadn't had the virtual safety car, he might have closed in on Alonso. You never know. But either way, I thought Perez actually did a pretty decent recovery drive after a very poor qualifying. But it was Bottas that just, had a terrible start, terrible early part of the race, and then had some terrible luck on top of all of that. And I don't know, it just doesn't, when it doesn't go well for Valtteri, it really doesn't go well, and it always seems to be him that suffers the bad luck with things like the puncture that ultimately ended his race. So yeah, difficult one for him, wasn't it? And it could well come down, particularly in fact in both championships, it could well come down to which of the second drivers, and I think we said this right at the start of the season, which of the second drivers can do the best job for their team and for their teammate. And that could really play an impact, given that things could be so close. We could go into the final race in Abu Dhabi with these two guys level or a point apart. That could easily happen. And then it could well come down to which one of the teammates manages to get themselves into the fight and can play a crucial role in the outcome of that Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. That could literally be one of the major deciding factors as to who comes out that weekend and therefore the championship on top. So, you know, both teams will be relying on their second drivers as much as they'll be relying on their first drivers over the next 2 weekends. Should we talk penalties? Right, let's talk penalties. So, well, this is going to be fairly short because I'm not sure there's too much to discuss with the penalties around the yellow flags and the double waved yellow flags. I think the fact that the drivers that got penalised were penalised rightly because they didn't slow down through yellows or double wave yellows. That's a bit of a slam dunk. The issue, and I don't think this should affect the penalties because I don't disagree with the penalties in any way, but there is definitely an issue, and Max and perhaps others have an argument to say that the system that they normally rely on for notifications of yellow flags and double wave yellows didn't work in their car. You know, and so the regulations rightly revert back to the old school way. If there's a guy waving a yellow flag or double wave yellow flags, you must slow down. And it's as simple as that. But from a driver's perspective, you've become so used to relying on lights on your dash as the indicator that there are yellow flags, or if there's a safety car or a virtual safety car or any of these things, you have systems on your dashboard that light up and flash at you to notify you of these things. And they will have been using these systems for years and become heavily reliant on them, way more so than the old school actual physical yellow flag. And so when those lights on your dash don't tell you there's a yellow flag, or you see a green, illuminated light panel at the side of the track, there's a good argument to say you would rely on those systems, as you always do, and keep it flat. And if you didn't see the guy waving the flag, I mean, it's a tough one, but you can't breach those regulations. They're very, very strict safety regs. And ultimately, these guys have to take it on the chin, which they did. Took it on the chin, apart from Christian Horner, who didn't really take it very well. But they have to take it on the chin and say, look, that one, the system's failed, or there was a system failure, process failure. But ultimately, you can't really argue there was a guy waving double yellow flags and Max didn't slow down. So if you disagree, let me know. Those yellow flags were super hard to see, says Mr. AJ Scotty. I 100% agree with you. How come Sainz didn't get a penalty? Because he did lift off. So Carlos Sainz came across a single waved yellow, but did back off. So that's why he didn't get a penalty. It really is as simple as that. And the others didn't, and therefore they did get a penalty. The difference between the 3 and the 5 place grid penalty, I'm sure you know this, but it's simply because the 3 place drop is for not slowing down past a single waved yellow. the 5-place drop is a standard penalty for not obeying to the double waved yellows. And it really is as simple as that. So I think, there's not too much to argue. However, the drivers, I think, have a right to feel also pretty hard done by, given that things didn't work as they normally would do. Right. Let me see. That's just it. Red Bull didn't take it on the chin. They spat their dummy out. Well, yes, they did. They got very upset by it. And Christian Horner was referred to the stewards after the race, wasn't he? He got an official warning. I've actually just read earlier that he's had to go and sort of sign up to, not quite community service, but he's had to sign up to be part of the Marshall's training program at the beginning of next year. So he's offered to do that, I believe. So, and he's offered to apologise, and he's come around and realises that it was a silly thing to say. But look, it wasn't a good weekend for Red Bull. I think this was part of it. I think Christian Horner, and we should talk about the whole idea about flexi rear wings and everything, but Christian Horner and the Red Bull team, I don't think came out this weekend looking great. Not just because the Mercedes car clearly seems like it's faster. They have the upper hand at the moment over the last 2 racetracks, and quite possibly over the next one as well, given the high-speed nature of that Saudi circuit. So they're riled, they are upset by that, but they didn't deal with it with the decorum that you might sort of assume that Mercedes would deal with these kind of things. And I don't want to assume too much, because until Mercedes face the same kind of thing, maybe we would see a different side of Toto and co. But I don't think Red Bull came out of this looking good. And, when you're in this massive championship fight, I honestly believe that public opinion can play a part in this, can help you or hinder you if you play it wrong. And I'll explain what I mean by that, because if you're in that team, and I know this from experience, when I was working with Lewis and we were chasing a championship, or even when we were chasing championships with Kimi, who was a very, very popular guy back then, particularly. He was like the young gun on the scene. I think everyone would have loved to see him upset the sort of Schumacher reign as it had been for a long, long period of time. Along came this young kid, Kimi, super cool. People wanted him to win. And inside the team, we felt that. We felt that sort of support from the wider F1 community, the crowd that weren't even necessarily just McLaren fans. We felt like people wanted Kimi to win in 2003 or 2005. And then when we get to Lewis Hamilton, we felt the weight of an entire nation when we were in Brazil in 2007 and 2008, knowing that people wanted Lewis to win that title in the most part. And that helps you because it boosts the confidence of people in the team. You burst out the garage with your chest puffed out and you kind of approach the weekend a little bit differently, knowing that you've got hundreds of thousands or millions of people on your side. And yet if it's the other way round, like off the back of coming out of 2007 and Spygate, when it felt to us inside the team, even though we'd had nothing to do with the Spygate scenario, it felt like the world outside thought we were cheats. And, I felt that. Have a massive negative impact on me and the rest of the team, because it felt like we'd been, our reputation had been heavily tarnished. This is front page news, don't forget, this $100 million fine. So the whole world knew that the McLaren team, which I was part of, were cheats. And so what I'm trying to say is those outside influences, the public opinion, can impact in both a positive or a negative way how you approach, these last 2 races. And if Christian Horner and the Red Bull guys start polarising people or even swinging people back towards Mercedes, which seems like an unlikely thing because you'd imagine the world wants a change of winner. They would love to see a different winner. And yet what happened this weekend and in a couple of weekends gone by, it feels like they've got the potential to swing people, if they're not already, back the other way, where they want Mercedes to beat the likes of Red Bull because they might be whinging too much. And look, I'm not saying that's how I see it, but I'm saying there is a danger that that kind of dynamic could happen, and the effect it could have on the people within that team, or both teams, to be fair, could play a part in this, could make a difference. Right, so Right, hold on. Where are we going here? Right. uh, Hold on, sorry, I'm just trying to read your comments. They're flying past. Right, Elvis, how do you reckon the 22 regulations are going to affect teams like Haas, Alfa Romeo and Williams? It's a good one, that. Okay, let's talk about that quickly. So 2022, I've no idea is the short answer how it's going to affect everybody. What I keep saying to everybody who asks this is that I think what you're going to get is the big teams today will still be the big teams next year. Even though we're on this budget cap where no one can use their financial might to outspend anyone else, the big teams still have the best people, they still have the best facilities, which they've had for years, the best factories, the best resources in terms of those people and tooling and equipment and facilities at their disposal. They've got the best expertise, they have experience of winning. The smaller teams are still the smaller teams in that typically you don't have quite the same calibre of people either in the engineering side or the driving side, and that's a generalisation, it's not always the case, but you don't necessarily quite have the best wind tunnel, or you might not have the same number of people in certain departments whereas others do. You might not have the best simulation tools, and those things will take some time to start levelling out over the course of the next 10 years of these regulations. So I don't expect the order to change up massively. However, the caveat to all of that is that with a new set of regulations, there are opportunities, particularly on the technical side, where somebody could exploit a way of doing something or a way of interpreting the new regulations differently to someone else, and that could literally catapult you from one end of the grid to the other. That could happen. We've seen it happen in the past. The thing that makes that less likely to happen this time around than it has done in previous years is that this time around the teams have been heavily involved in shaping the regulations from a very early stage with a view to trying to close any potential loopholes before the regs get finally published. So, you know, you can argue, well, surely if someone spots a loophole, they're going to keep it quiet. Absolutely, but everybody has that opportunity to spot a loophole. So you don't know if someone else is keeping something quiet. You don't know if someone else is already more advanced on the loophole that you spotted. And so it's kind of self-policing in that most people have thought it's the best idea to flag these loopholes, get them closed off, stop people spending a fortune to try and exploit them, and make it as level a playing field as possible. There will still be opportunities, but they're less likely to be the giant gaping ones like a double diffuser, that kind of thing, I would imagine. So for those smaller teams, it should bring them closer to the pack, because although they may still not be at the budget cap limit, everyone else will come back down towards them, and therefore the gap between the back of the grid and the front of the grid should be much smaller in terms of spending. And as I said, it may not have an immediate impact from day one, but I think over the course of the next few years, the idea is that performance gap will begin shrinking, and of course that's the whole point of them. So who could be the 2022 Brawn? Well, I mean, anybody could. That's the exact point, isn't it? The fact that Brawn did it back then was just no rhyme or reason to the fact that it was Brawn. It was just them that came up with that particular idea. As I say, we may not get such giant loopholes this time around, but we'll have to wait and see. Are Red Bull sandbagging strategically, knowing they only needed second place? I very, very much doubt it. The idea of sandbagging, I think the idea of sandbagging in Formula One rarely ever happens, and only ever happens when a team has such a giant performance advantage over somebody that they don't want that to become so obvious that regulations start getting changed to peg them back, which is the sort of thing that that Brawn did. When they suddenly realised they had this mega car when they first started testing, they started then immediately on day 2 or 3 filling up with fuel and running only with full tanks to try and sandbag and hold things back. That's a very, very rare occurrence, and it's such a risky game to play. I really can't see why they would do that. No one would want to take it to the wire anyway, because imagine if Max gets a puncture and they've been sandbagging going for second place, and yet next race he gets a puncture and Lewis takes the full 25 points. It would make no sense. Right. Hit the like button, says P1. I couldn't agree more. Please do that. That'd be lovely. 197 likes, nearly 1,000 of you watching. Come on, we can do better than that. I don't know if my mum's watching tonight, but you know how angry she gets if you don't hit the like button. Right. The rules only allow sandbagging in pre-season testing. Well, yes, in terms of actually putting in bags of sand or extra weight, I agree with you. There are, of course, ways to slow your car down if you wanted to. I just can't see why anybody would want to. Why did they not define driving guides for running a driver off the track in the drivers' meeting? Ah, good point. So let's wind it back then to the very beginning of this weekend when the stewards were asked whether they would take another look at the incident from the Brazilian Grand Prix, weren't they, to decide whether it actually was worthy of an investigation, something that at the Brazilian Grand Prix was decided it wasn't worthy of that investigation. Mercedes presented the camera angle that had just emerged, the onboard camera from Max's car, said, here's some new evidence. We think that's worthy or enough evidence for you to take a closer look. They said no. Now, the interesting thing about that, there's two interesting things. Firstly, I think they didn't do that, which sort of sets a precedent in that what happened in Brazil, surely it has to be deemed okay. The problem with it is it's very inconsistent with what happened in other races earlier this season where people did get penalised for some seemingly less serious infringements. So that's a big problem. The problem the stewards had here was if they did take another look at that and then, penalise Max or not penalise, take a look at it, investigate it and say, right, we got it right. There was no penalty. You've then got to sort of question all the previous decisions that went beforehand and go, well, do other teams now start throwing up new evidence, saying we've got some new evidence. We want you to take a look at this previous incident where you deemed it was a penalty and we now think it shouldn't be. You open up a massive can of worms if you start setting a precedent that goes absolutely against a previous incident that was investigated. By not investigating it, they've sort of covered themselves a little bit. Not entirely, because I still think it's crazy, but if you investigate it and then come up one side or the other of that line, you've put a very clear definition of what is okay and what isn't. So I think it would have been very, very difficult for them to reopen that case without having a massively complicated discussion after that would have run on and on and on. So I wasn't surprised they didn't look into it. The other point around that was I didn't actually think that the onboard camera angle from Max's car offered anything particularly new or offered anything that I hadn't seen from the first incident. And that's to say that when I saw it first time, I thought it should have been a penalty if we're going to be consistent with what happened earlier this season. So it was a hugely difficult one. The stewards have got a very complicated task right now because the stakes are so high. But all anyone wants from them is consistency. And I think that is the real challenge. It's a very difficult, fine line to tread. I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. Tell me what you think. Did you agree with what they came up with or not? Do you think they should have gone back in and had another look, given that new camera angle? Did you think that was enough evidence to say, look, here's conclusive proof that Max didn't turn into the corner or whatever? I didn't think it offered anything more than what we saw before, even though I think that was enough to justify a penalty. Right, the rules say, yeah, you're right, I've just realised what I said there. The rules say you can only appeal 14 days after the incident. You're absolutely right. So we couldn't go back into previous ones from Austria and say we want you to reopen that case. You are right. I apologise. Right, will Max be world champion before your house is done? I'll tell you what, it could well be. At this rate, the whole grid could go through a series of becoming world champion before this place is done. Bloody Windows, waiting for Windows, delay after delay after delay. But you don't want to be about that. Marc, haven't seen your dog in ages. Yeah, sorry about that. Follow me on Instagram. That's the best place. Or probably more so my wife. You'll find the pictures of dogs on there. Do you think that cars will be similar to the default 22 car? I wonder if the regulations prevent step noses or elephant ears. So yes, I don't think we're going to get any major shape differences from what we've seen as the default or spec car that was kind of launched by F1 as an example. I don't think we'll see massive differences in terms of the overall shape. The rules are very, very prescriptive for next year. I think the details, the nuances are going to be, as they always are, in the small aerodynamic details. It's going to be about how you move the new flow path of air, because it's a very different way of channeling airflow from the front of the car, from the front wing, to this new underside and massive venturi that sits under the car now, as opposed to funneling it down the sides, over the top of the floor, sealing off diffusers in that way that we have done before. And of course using the wings over the top of the car to generate downforce. This is going to be a very different philosophy about how we do it. And so in the same way we see massive differences in terms of barge boards and front wing flaps and flick ups, I think those are the areas that are going to see the most work and the most constant updates and changes coming. Just like we see now, they'll just be in different places and they'll just be slightly different looking and doing a very different job. But it's going to be about that constant fine tuning with the tiny little flick ups and flaps that, you know, we kind of see appearing on cars over the course of a season as things are. I don't think that will change too much. You haven't mentioned Lewis's old rival Fernando. Absolutely, we haven't talked about Fernando yet, have we? So we haven't really talked about Lewis either. So two great multiple champions that drove two great races this weekend. Lewis, first of all, was in a league of his own, and yes, he has a car that is absolutely performing at the moment, but you know, so does Valtteri Bottas, and Lewis is the only one really making it work to such dominant effect. So he is in the form of his life, and you've got to say Lewis was just in utter control on Sunday. I mean, he just did everything right, very, very measured, built a gap. I think probably had more performance in hand if he wanted to, just managed that gap all the way to the end. It was probably a pretty dull race from his perspective, but it was exactly what he needed to do. Just get the points, bring it home. So hats off to Lewis. He just delivered when under pressure. Great start, run away with it. Fernando, I thought also drove a spectacular race, because his race, of course, was on a one-stop strategy. I mean, yes, the car came alive this weekend in the hands of both their drivers. They just got it right. The tyres were working. The aero balance seemed just right. The car's very kind on its tyres, isn't it? Certainly in the hands of those two guys, they're managing to make tyres last. And yeah, one stopper for Fernando. I'm sure there were some twitchy moments towards the end as the tyres started failing around them, but he kept it on the, off the curbs. He managed to manage the drive in terms of making those tyres last. And look, getting a podium was a podium on merit. And I think that's the thing. That was a podium and a fifth place for Esteban Ocon, but on merit. They beat the Ferraris, they beat the McLarens on pure pace. No luck involved there. They didn't luck into those positions. You could say when they won the race in Budapest, that was an unusual set of circumstances. But here, that was just the pace of their car. And that's a really positive sign for them. It may well be circuit specific, but they did a very, very good job. And Fernando's experience, it's no coincidence that Fernando, with the experience he has of managing Formula One Grand Prix from start to finish, was able to deliver on a pretty difficult strategy under some pressure at times, and managed to hold it out and run it right through to the end. Delivered exactly what the team needs. And you could see how much it meant to him. That's a third place. This guy's won 2 world championships, and yet that third place felt like a win for him and the team. And that says a lot to me. That says, A, he still has the passion and the hunger, for Formula One, which is great to see. But also he was really passionate about what that meant to this team, that he's trying to build around him with potential view to an assault on the championship, or at least assault on race wins from next year onwards. 2022 is why he came back into Formula One. You don't forget those regulations were supposed to be out this year. They've been pushed back after the pandemic. But Fernando is building up towards, I think, what he thinks could well be a great year for him and the team. Now, whether it is or not, I've got absolutely no idea, and I probably nor has he, nor has anyone at this point. But a result like that yesterday will have been a massive boost for everybody, and that's the best you can sort of hope for when you're one of those midfield teams, is to drag a car onto the podium every now and again, give everyone a reason to celebrate, get the champagne out. As I said earlier, those things that happen behind the scenes still have a big impact to those working away on your project, on your car, behind the scenes, back at the factory. It gives everyone a boost, and that literally can translate into more performance or a better outcome for you over the course of a Grand Prix weekend. So he knows that, he's experienced enough to know that, and his team will have appreciated the passion they saw from their driver as he got out of the car and up onto the podium for that P3 result. So great job by Fernando and for Lewis. So where we got? 15 minutes to go. Right. Chris A says, Mark, which car manufacturers or brands do you think will most likely want to join F1 as race teams? Well, we know that the Volkswagen Audi group are very interested. That's not even just rumours, that's happening. Discussions have happened at very, very high levels, both in terms of engine supply into the future for the next generation, but even more, earlier than that, in terms of looking at either taking over or joining teams. We know that Volkswagen Audi, this is no secret, they've spoken to Williams, they've clearly spoken to McLaren, and maybe others as well. The Haas team is up for sale if there's a decent bidder for it. Andretti have been sniffing around that. So I think the Volkswagen Audi group are, whichever brand they choose to throw in, and it may be more than one, but whichever brand they choose, I think it will come from that group. They seem the most likely entrant at the moment. But that has to come through buying an entry, through taking over an existing team. It makes no financial sense. There are too many financial penalties to starting an extra team right now. Nobody would do that in their right mind. So it has to be taking over a McLaren or a Williams or a Haas or somebody else. So that's where it's going to come from. And I suspect Volkswagen Audi Group are the most likely at this stage. Do you think Alfa Romeo are right to sign Guanyu? Do you know what? I don't know enough about him. I'm going to reserve judgment on this. I spoke to a couple of people actually over the weekend who do know him and have worked with him, and they actually rate him highly. Yes, he's got money behind him, but that's not a reason not to employ somebody if he's a good driver, and he clearly has talent. He's had some great results. I don't know him well enough, as I say, but look, let's reserve judgment and see what he can do when he gets in the car. But he's not a slouch. He's not somebody who has money but no talent. He may have money, but he's definitely got talent as well. So let's see how that matches up. Have you talked about Red Bull's complaints about the rear wing? So we touched on it, Chris. Let's talk about it in more depth because that was interesting. We didn't really get an outcome. But Red Bull, they didn't lodge a formal complaint. They didn't lodge an actual protest, but they did speak to the FIA about their concerns, which happens, and this happens all the time. Teams are going down to see Joe Bauer, the technical delegate, all the time over a race weekend, and certainly all the time over a season, to say, look, we've seen this on another team, or we've had this idea. Can you just clarify, is this legal? If we did it, would it be legal? We think they're doing it. Can you just tell us that if they were doing that, would it be legal or would it be illegal? And the question that Red Bull have is that the trailing edge of the main plane, so the big plane at the top of the rear wing, if you think about an F1 rear wing, it has the main plane, which is the big dished part, the lower element at the top, and then it has the upper flap on top of that, which is the DRS flap that opens and closes. Well, the main plane trailing edge, so as it tapers away, as it curls up towards the top edge, the profile of that wing also tapers, it becomes very thin, and it's that trailing edge that Red Bull are suggesting there is flex. That maybe not all the way along it, but perhaps just at the outer edges, which would have a big impact in terms of reducing drag. It flexes or moves at the highest load, so when you reach maximum velocity, maybe those trailing edges just taper away, just fold back a little bit, reducing drag. Now, the reason they say that, a number of things. They say that since the last couple of races, they have seen a massive improvement in their straight line speeds. They have then gone in on their own investigation through, high-speed photography and extra zoom lens photography, getting close-up pictures of the trailing edge of that rear wing, and they've seen, you've probably seen the pictures now, these little witness marks on the end plate that they suggest is from the rear wing main plane trailing edge just flexing at speed and rubbing against the end plate, creating a mark. That's the theory behind it. They've got various shots from their own photographers, which is not unusual. All teams do that too. But combining that with their GPS data traces and various other factors that they have, all sorts of information, they build a dossier of information about their competitors. And again, that's not massively unusual. Mercedes will be doing exactly the same kind of things for Red Bull. They have concluded that they're pretty sure Red Bull are doing something with their rear wing to reduce drag. Now, first of all, when I first heard this, I thought there's no way Mercedes would do that. It seems like such an obvious thing, an obvious way to get caught, particularly given the furore around rear wings and flexible rear wings that happened earlier this season. So it felt like a very strange thing for them to do. And actually, you know, and Red Bull are not stupid. They know that Mercedes have this extreme collapsible rear suspension, which will, of course, dump drag down the straight. So that will have an impact. I don't think for a second they're getting confused and thinking it's the rear wing when it's actually that. They'll know all of these things. But even with that information factored into their predictions and their calculations, they still think the rear wing must be flexing. And they must be very convinced to go to the FIA, to come out in public and suggest these kind of things. And yet the FIA then went on Saturday afternoon and said, okay, well, look, we're gonna look into it, because they have the power to do these rear wing flexure tests or pullback tests. They can do them at any point. It's in the rules. They can do that. And so on Saturday they said, look, we'll look into it. We'll take it on board and we'll investigate. So they did a bunch of random tests on a number of cars, as they often do at other races. And as far as we know, they didn't find anything untoward. I can only imagine that Red Bull must be suggesting Mercedes have found a way to beat that test, in a similar way to the way Red Bull did earlier in the season, designed their wing to pass the test, but then flex beyond the loads the test was designed for. They must have be assuming that Red Bull are doing something similar, or the areas where this rear wing trailing edge is flexing are not the areas where the pullback is happening, where the clamp from the pullback test sits, or something like that. I find it such a strange scenario that A, Mercedes would go to those lengths, because I just don't think they would, and B, Red Bull are so convinced that they're willing to come out in public and say this. So I'm not sure where the truth lies in all of that, and maybe it will come out in the wash. But the reason Red Bull was so interested in that here is they know we've got two very high-speed circuits coming up in terms of Saudi, which is a very high-speed street circuit, and then Abu Dhabi, where straight line speed will genuinely be a massive advantage. And so they wanted to try and flush this out, if indeed it is something dodgy, way ahead of those two rounds. So I think it's potentially going to run on. I don't know if it will run on, or whether Red Bull will just go away cap in hand and say, okay, we got it wrong. That seems unlikely in itself. So we'll have to wait and see, perhaps, to see if there is a final outcome in all of this. Yeah, memory, carbon fibre. Look, so in terms of flexible components, there's a huge amount of work that all teams have done in doing this. Red Bull have actually led this in terms of composite layouts, composite carbon layups that are very detailed and complex in the fibres they use, the way those fibres are interlocked and interlinked with each other, the way they're laid up in the structure of the carbon, designed very specifically to flex at very specific loads. Huge amount of work and research has gone into that over many, many years. So there are a huge amount of possibilities that you can do with different techniques, different materials, different constructions of those materials. So it's not that this kind of thing wouldn't be possible. It absolutely could well be possible, and that's probably the sort of thing Red Bull are suggesting, absolutely. So Mercedes had score marks on their wing. Yes, absolutely, that's what started the process, as I said. The scratches could be abrasion from sand. No, I think the scratches, or the picture that you saw, that we've all seen, I'm sure, it does very much look, I mean, you could easily explain it in exactly the way that Red Bull have explained it. You know, when I saw the pictures and I heard their remarks, you look at it and go, oh yeah, that looks like it's exactly what's happening, that the trailing edge is just flexing back at load. It's very difficult to say from those pictures, but it looked like maybe 10 mil or so at its uppermost edge. The most amount of flex you're allowed to have in this pullback test is 2 millimeters. So that, you know, on the face of it would seem illegal. But It might also be just from when it was fitted that someone was wiggling it into position, and I mean, that seems unlikely because they wouldn't have left it looking like that. But I can't explain it. The only explanation I have seen is the one from Red Bull, but I'm sure that, you know, Mercedes have their own explanation. They just may not have made that public. Right, 5 minutes. How impressed are you with Alonso? Were you not here 10 minutes ago? Jimmy Page? We've just discussed Alonso. Very, very impressed. I thought he did a very, very good job. Right, 5 minutes to go. So let's talk about the next one then. Saudi Arabia, Jeddah circuit. Looks like a really interesting circuit. I'm really intrigued, like massively intrigued to see. Because my house is a building site, I haven't got my simulator out. It's in storage at the moment, unfortunately, so I haven't been able to use that. But I believe there are some simulations doing the rounds. I'd love to sort of have a go on it. I can't wait to see the cars on it. It's incredibly high speed, and yet it's a street circuit. So it feels like there is massive potential for things to go wrong. You know, there are walls very close to the edge of the racetrack. It's not just that it has a very long straight, which it does, by the way. And you've got to look at Mercedes' straight line speed and say that long straight looks like it's a real opportunity for Mercedes to do very, very well there. If they can exploit their straight line speed, you know, you could easily move through the field if you don't qualify well, and therefore you could potentially set your car up much more in terms of race performance, looking after tyres, and perhaps just outright qualifying, because overtaking would seemingly appear to be relatively straightforward, particularly with DRS down that long straight. But also some of the corners also very quick. So unlike Baku, where you had the incredibly long straight, but lots of really tight, twisty, right-angled corners for the rest of the lap, this has some really interesting corners. I don't know what overtaking is going to be like away from that long straight. It's difficult to see from the map, but I'm really intrigued to see how Formula One cars deal with it and the speeds they reach. There's, as I say, potential for things to go horribly wrong. There is potential for an upset in terms of an accident or a crash during the weekend that could really upset the rest of your weekend in terms of getting into the flow. You know, destroy a chassis early on and miss a session. You could well be struggling as the weekend goes on whilst everyone else is learning this new track, getting lap after lap. So those details are going to be important. But I'm really intrigued. I think on paper you might favour Mercedes for that one. Then you could look at Abu Dhabi and say, well, okay, look, Max has been strong around there. I mean, Lewis has been strong as well, but Max has a car very capable of being quick around Abu Dhabi too. So it's very, very difficult to call. That's what I love about it so much. I can't wait for these last two rounds. I mean, look, the neutral in me kind of wants Lewis to shade this one and come out in front in Jeddah, with Max coming second. So we go into the final round neck and neck, and then it's just all out. Winner takes all in Abu Dhabi. Wouldn't that be spectacular? On an Abu Dhabi circuit, by the way, which has some major layout changes to the way that we've seen it in the past. Whether it makes a huge difference to the racing, we're yet to see, but it has some major changes. So lots to look forward to over these next two rounds. It's basically 9 o'clock, guys. I don't know how that's flown by, but it really has flown by. Yeah, Lewis has the spicy engine for the next two races, doesn't he? They didn't use it this time out because it wasn't such a power-dominant circuit. So that engine he put in Brazil, which they can crank up a little bit, give that extra performance, that will be back, giving another advantage potentially to Lewis. So that's one to keep an eye out. Best season in years, says Sig Ni. Yes, absolutely. Simple question, who's going to win it? Do you know what? Oh, it's difficult to say, isn't it? I feel like Lewis is in such a strong form, and at the moment has a car that Red Bull can't really match. But there are so many other factors. It's never ever just a straight fight. There's so many other factors that could play into this. As I said, a number of things that could happen at a brand new circuit, high-speed street circuit at Jeddah. There are tyres at play. There are reliability issues at play. There will undoubtedly be stewards' decisions which will come into play, and I hope this just turns out to be a brilliant battle between two of the best drivers in this sport, in two of the best cars, in the two fastest cars that we might ever see in Formula One. Although having said that, the next year's cars, the 2022 cars, are already seemingly going pretty much as quick as this year. So maybe we'll still get faster F1 cars next year. We'll have to wait and see. It's 10 o'clock. It's 10 o'clock. Sorry, guys, we're going to have to go. Thank you so much. I apologise. I didn't get to as many of your questions as I hoped, but thank you so much. Roy says it's 9 a.m. in Sydney. Well, good morning to you, Roy. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Thanks to you all. Have a wonderful week. I'll be back here next week anyway, even though there's no Grand Prix. So same time, same place next week. And then just 2 races to go, which will decide this championship. I can't wait. Let's come back next week and talk about it all over again. So listen, thank you so much, everybody. Have a good one. I'll catch you soon.